The first class is once again class A when looking at the first octet of an IPv4 address. In other words, if we've got x.x.x.x, we're looking at the first octet or first 8 bits. The first octet always starts with a binary 0. So in the first octet or the first 8 bits, the first bit is set to 0. Now if we go through all the combinations in binary in the first octet, that means we'll end up with combinations from 0 in decimal up to 127 in decimal. So the range for class A addresses is from 0.0.0.0 up to 127.255.255.255. So for completeness, let's briefly look at that. Class A in the first octet has binary values where the first bit is set to 0. So the first entry would be 8 binary zeros, which equates to 0 in decimal. The next binary entry is 7 zeros and a binary 1, which equates to decimal 1. Going through all the combinations, 2, 3, 4, and so forth and so on, will end up at 127. So in the first octet, a class A address always starts with 0 for the first bit, and the combinations are from 0 to 127 in decimal. Now, as always in life, there are some exceptions. So in class A, there are exceptions where 127 is reserved for the loopback. I'll explain the loopback address in more detail in a moment. You cannot, as an example, configure an IP address of 127.0.0.1 on a PC. That is not an address that's available for you to configure manually as a static address on a PC, for example. 0 is reserved for the default network, so that can't be used either to configure an IP address on a PC. So you couldn't give your PC an IP address of 0.1.1.1. So the actual range for class A addresses is the range 1.0.0.0, going through all the combinations up to 126.255.255.255. So in the first octet, the values are from 1 to 126 for class A addresses. Notice that on my PC, as an example, if I go to the local area connection properties and select IPv4, and then I try and configure an IP address of 127, the PC tells me that that's not possible. IP addresses starting with 127 are not valid because they are reserved for loopback addresses. We need to specify an IP address in the range 1 to 223. In the same way, if we try and configure an IP address of 0, Windows in this example tells us that that IP address is not valid, and we need to specify a value between 1 and 223. So class A addresses are in the range 1 to 126 in the first octet. So in summary, in a class A address, the first 8 bits denote network, and the last 24 bits denote host. This is determined by the IANA. So an address like 10.1.1.1 implies that this is a class A address. The first 8 bits is network, and the remaining 24 bits is host. The next class of address is class B. Class B addresses start with binary 10. Please note that's not 10 in decimal, it's binary 10.